Go for it.
Thank you. First of all, thank all of you for finding time in your busy schedule. One of the priorities of the SCJA's board this year has been working to improve wellness for judicial officers. We all have extremely challenging jobs, and we're working very hard to do what we can to make everybody's jobs a little bit easier. And to that end, I'm the assigned lead on the work-life balance work group. And one of the things, you may have seen the January challenge to improve activity and fluid consumption, hydration. And then there was the self-trauma test. And we are very grateful for Dr. Randall, who is presenting this webinar on wellness. So it's a high priority for us. I've got a great work group that's working very diligently to try to find things in response to the survey that we sent out in January. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Judge Chung, who's going to introduce Dr. Randall, but I'd like to extend my personal gratitude to Dr. Randall for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Judge Zamblin. I'm Sam Chung from King County Superior Court. I'm also the president-elect of SCJA, Superior Court Judges Association. I try not to use too many acronyms as much as possible. That adds to more stress, I think. We're honored to have Dr. Cameron Randall, who's a professor at the University of Washington School of Dentistry. He was instrumental during the height of COVID when he came to speak to us at King County Superior Court, and we did a number of sessions on wellness. He's an expert on the issue of stress, and I hope by the end of this session we'll all be out of our stress. We're going to try to have the questions on chat, but I'll monitor them, and then we'll have Dr. Randall address those at the end of his session. And so if you have any comments or things like that, just feel free to use the chat function. And then I'll just turn it over to Dr. Randall now. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Judge Chung. And hello, everybody. Welcome to the session. I was just so pleased to receive this invitation to speak with you all. You might wonder, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and you might wonder what a psychologist is doing working as a professor in a dental school. I study pain related to dental procedures and also related to toothache and chronic orofacial pain. But I also study fear and anxiety related to dentistry and people's health behaviors too. And so one of the things that happened during the pandemic is because the dentist office is a stressful place for lots of patients, and because I lots of research and work in the area of that stress, the fear and anxiety and stress related to dentistry, I got roped into doing some work looking at provider well-being and how dental providers are doing when it comes to managing their own stress. And so then I became, I guess, a little bit of an expert in the stress and well-being and wellness for our workforce. And so that's how I got linked up with Judge Chung. And so I gave some sessions to the King County Superior Court, which was really nice. So I'm going to share some things that came from those sessions and some new things, focusing mostly on sleep today, because I was asked to talk about sleep. And I'll give a brief background to stress and burnout and well-being generally to start. So with that, I'd like to show you something that hopefully isn't too triggering, this image of the coronavirus. And so, gosh, it was about this time, 3 years ago, that we were introduced to this image and to really a lot of changes in the way that the world works and in the way that we work at work because of the pandemic. And there's been quite a bit of transition over these couple of years, and things I think are better, but indeed it still remains a stressful and difficult time for people. And that is especially true for people who were in public service roles in healthcare roles and other kind of service-oriented roles, both in their work life and in their personal life. And so really the pandemic kind of contributed additional stress, and it made things that exacerbated the stress that we experience. And so it's really important then to understand how stress operates and what we can do about it. So it's interesting because the pandemic brought on all this talk of stress and burnout, but those things were around before. And so hopefully there's this kind of new interest in dealing with stress and burnout as a result of the pandemic, not only because the pandemic has increased levels of stress and burnout, but also because it kind of shed light on what a problem this is for us. So I'll be sharing some insights from clinical psychology and from behavioral medicine today with you about stress and burnout. And then, like I said, sleep in particular as a way to manage stress. So I'd like to start then by making a distinction between two kinds of stress. Stress is the response that we experience in the context of a stressor. A stressor is some kind of a challenge or big event or difficult event that comes up in our life. Stressors don't necessarily have to be bad. So a lot of times when people think about big stressors, they think of a car accident or the death of a loved one or a house fire. It could be something really big and really catastrophic. But there can also be positive stressors. So things like a marriage, right? A big life transition, or planning for a wedding, or introducing a new baby into the family. These things are generally positive, but they also are stressful because they come with some sort of big adjustment or kind of a new challenge in our world. And so we can respond to both positive and negative stressors in the stress that we experience similarly. So psychologists make a distinction between two kinds of stress. Acute stress is the stress response that we experience in the context of an acute stressor. This usually is a major event. It's usually a time-limited event. And oftentimes it's a big kind of traumatic event. So this might be the car accident or the house fire or a big major deadline that you have coming up or a move or that wedding. It's not necessarily the kind of stress or stressor that's going to stick with you for a long time, thus the name acute stress. And we humans actually are pretty good at dealing with acute stress. We really don't need many special skills in general to deal with acute stressors. And that's because our stress response that has evolved over time really helps us to prepare to deal with the challenge and then to deal with it. So in most cases, for most acute stressors and the acute stress, we're fine. The fight or flight response helps us to prepare, and we can kind of deal with the crisis or the big event or the big challenge or the new transition pretty well. What's actually much more difficult to deal with is this other kind of stress that psychologists talk about, and that is chronic stress. Chronic stress is the experience of stress over a long period of time, could be months or years, in the context of chronic stressors. And chronic stressors tend to be much lower level challenges or threats or difficulties. Chronic stressors tend to be things like living in a really noisy city, or having to deal with lots of traffic, or maybe not lots of traffic, but a really long commute to get to work, or dealing with a loved one who has a chronic illness. And so that person is going to need to be cared for a long period of time. So there are lots of different chronic stressors that tend to be lower level, and they persist over a long period of time. That's what makes them chronic. So while they might not feel like they're as big of a deal as the acute stressors, they actually are a much bigger deal because we humans are not evolved to deal with chronic stress the same way we are acute stress. The response that we have to deal with acute stress is not one that is really sustainable. It's not one that we can continue over long periods of time and not have some sort of effect, negative effect on our physical and emotional well-being. So chronic stress is actually the thing that really concerns psychologists and the thing that we really want to deal with. Not that acute stressors and acute stress and traumas and big challenges aren't important, but it's this kind of low-level stress that really can impact us in some negative ways, and it doesn't always get the kind of attention or credit that it deserves. And so that's what I hope we'll pay attention to. When chronic stress is unresolved over a long period of time, it tends to lead to burnout. That's feelings of disillusionment and dissatisfaction, just kind of being over it, right? And then pulling away or withdrawing from the tasks at hand. And we really have established a few different, in psychology, we've established a few different understandings of burnout. And one that I think is helpful in thinking about stress in the context of the pandemic, and also in the context of some of the work-related stressors that we experience as a result of changes because of the pandemic, and also just kind of new challenges in day-to-day life. One of those models for understanding is something known as crisis fatigue. So when a big stressor comes along, especially one that might be kind of life-changing, so kind of an acute stressor that turns into a chronic stressor, we move through a few phases in this crisis fatigue model. The first is the heroic phase, and this is when we kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, we deal with the situation at hand, and that tends to be really resource intensive, so it can be really demanding either physically or emotionally, right? So that's okay for a little while. You're not sleeping much, you're spending a lot of energy kind of mentally or emotionally dealing with the new crisis or the new challenge at hand. And you're a hero in the moment for doing it. So the example here is, everyone who pitched in very early on in the pandemic to figure out how they were going to change workflows and work policies and work procedures and transition to a completely virtual environment. And we kind of figured that out overnight. Or how are we going to homeschool our children and help them deal with, with learning via Zoom and this sort of thing overnight. And so we dealt with that in the same way we deal with acute stressors, and it tends to work pretty well. The nice thing is that that's followed typically by a honeymoon phase in this crisis fatigue model. And that's where we kind of band together and socialize and get support from and support other people who are in a similar situation. So we kind of realize that people, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers are going through the same sorts of things. And we feel like we've got this kind of mastery over the crisis. And things are good. There's some social connection, and we can kind of breathe easy for a minute. The issue, though, is when that acute crisis kind of transitions into a more chronic crisis or chronic challenge or stressor, we then move into two not so good phases. Those are the disillusionment phase and the fatigue phase. In the disillusionment phase, as the name implies, some of that honeymoon stuff wears off. We're no longer thinking that the stressor and dealing with the stressor is interesting. It's no longer novel, and we're just kind of getting tired of it. And as we kind of withdraw and we become a little bit less engaged with dealing with the stressor in a really active way, either because it's no longer interesting or no longer super pressing, or just because the energy, we move into this fatigue phase. And the fatigue phase has been likened to burnout. And that is, you're just truly over it and you don't have much left to give. Your resources really are depleted. Your cognitive or mental resources, your emotional resources, your physical resources are gone, or they're running really low. So here your tank is on empty and you're likely to experience burnout. Which is where you find little satisfaction or joy in the work activities or personal activities or family obligations that you used to find joy in. And you find that you're just kind of less engaged with them and less interested in kind of taking care of those things. So it's really these phases that we're interested in because they are the problem that comes from chronic stressors and the chronic stress experience. I'd like to point out just a couple of other causes of burnout, or kind of major contributors to burnout, that are helpful to know about, just so you can be aware of them. The first is negative reflections or negative self-talk. So when we think and maybe talk to ourselves pessimistically or negatively about big challenges or big stressors, or minor challenges or minor stressors in our lives, where we might say something like, oh, this sort of thing always happens to me, or I just don't have it in me to take care of this next challenge. That kind of negative self-talk, if it plays on repeat, can be a major contributor to burnout in the context of this chronic stress. Another major contributor to burnout is technology. So in lots of ways, technology is a really good thing. It's kept us connected during the pandemic. Lots of the apps on my phone do lots of amazing things, and they really have improved life in many ways. They make us more efficient. You can find any piece of information you've ever wanted on your phone. And things like Instagram, at least for me, are really entertaining. I love lots of social media that's out there. The issue with technology, though, is that too much of it is too much of a good thing. And that's because we aren't really good at multitasking. When you perceive that you're multitasking, what's actually happening, according to decades of psychological research, is that you're able to shift your attention between tasks or between needs really quickly. And so it's not that you're actually paying attention to two things at the same time and handling two tasks at the same time. What you're doing is you're switching your attention between those two tasks, and you're switching your kind of activities as related to the two tasks really quickly and efficiently. And that's a good skill to have, but it's also exhausting. And the problem with technology is that it requires us to do this multitasking, right? Because it is designed, the apps that we use, the news programs that we watch on TV, it's all designed to keep us coming back, to hold our attention, to keep scrolling. And so while we think that technology can make us really efficient, it really interferes with this multitasking that we're not actually able to do very well. So too much technology, right? Too much news, too much social media apps, too many reminders on your phone for your emails and your calendar invites can be too much of a good thing, because it's quite cognitively taxing for us. Another thing that contributes to burnout in the context of chronic stress is broken or fractured social relationships or social bonds. This is one of the reasons that the pandemic was really difficult for all of us, as it really changed the way we connect with others and stay connected with others socially. So while I appreciated Zoom happy hours early in the course of the pandemic, they're just not as good as real happy hours and hanging out with my friends in real life. There's a reason I don't still do Zoom happy hours, right? As good as regular happy hours. And so it's nice that we could have that sort of connection, but having real, deep, meaningful social connection, even for the introverts in the room, you all still need it. You still need it, even if it's just with a few people, or even if it's not as much as extroverts. Having those social connections is really important. So when we're in a situation in our work life or in our personal life where we have strained or fractured social connections, social bonds, we're much more at risk for burnout. Another thing that is a well-documented contributor to burnout is caregiving. And the image here is of a mother with child, but there's all kinds of caregiving that we do. So we may be a mentor to someone, we may be caring for an aging parent or another older adult. We may be taking care of an adult child that has some special needs. And caregiving responsibilities, either caring for other people or caring for patients, in volunteer roles, can be really taxing for us. And when those caregiving responsibilities are increased or when they're complicated, we're much more likely to experience burnout. And last, when we lose a sense of direction or a sense of purpose, we then lose a sense of meaning and a sense of reward or reinforcement from the work that we're doing or from the hobbies that we're engaged in. And so losing that sense of purpose is a really critical source of burnout, especially in the context of chronic stress. So I mentioned these well-documented sources of burnout so that you can be aware of them and so that you can start to think about them and start to address them. The problem is that our world is full of some of these sources of burnout, and our world is full of chronic and acute stress, right? Even if you're living a really charmed life, you're going to experience stress from time to time. And so we really need something to deal with the stress, to deal with the stressors so that we can prevent burnout. And the hot topic during the pandemic, it wasn't talked about as much before, but now everyone knows the term and everyone was talking about it all the time, is resilience. You've probably heard this a bunch. That if you just have resilience, you can deal with anything. Now, I'm a big proponent as a behavioral psychologist of trying to reduce the stressors in the world, reduce the challenges, make life easier for everybody so we don't have to be super resilient. I don't want people to need to have special skills in order to deal with the stress of life. And at the same time, life is stressful. And so it's helpful to be resilient. So what is resilience? It's really most simply our ability to bounce back quickly in the face of stressors or challenges in our lives. And the more efficiently you can recover from the stress that comes from these challenges, the better, right? You're not so impacted by them. And so while it's really important to try to minimize the challenges that people face in the world, the reality is we will experience them. So it's good to be resilient. And there are a couple of categories of approaches from psychology that we can use to be resilient, that we can use to manage stress and to stay well. Some of those are related to us, kind of our own behaviors, our own psychology, our own kind of mental health, our own coping skills. And then others are related to the environment, how we structure our world, how we structure our day, how our neighborhoods and workplaces can promote well-being and can minimize stress. And so we really need these two different kinds of approaches. We can't leave it all up to people individually to be resilient using those coping skills. At the same time, not here to change your work environment in any meaningful way. That's not something I can do in this 30-40 minute talk. So I'm going to teach you some kind of individual level coping skills. And in particular, we'll talk about sleep today. So before we talk about sleep though, I'd like to just mention that our well-being, our mental health, and our ability to be resilient is easily explained by what's called the cognitive behavioral model of emotion. So this is something that I use with my patients when I'm talking to them about thoughts and feelings and behaviors during a therapy session. But it really applies to all people all the time. You don't necessarily need to be depressed or anxious in order for this to apply. And so what lots of research over lots of different fields within psychology has shown us over many decades is that what we think and what we say out loud impacts how we feel about the world and how we feel emotionally. And at the same time, our emotions impact what we think. So if you're feeling down, you'll be more likely to have negative thoughts or pessimistic thoughts. Likewise, our behaviors influence our emotions. What we do or don't do influences how we feel, be that sad or depressed or anxious or happy. And likewise, our emotions, if you're feeling down, for instance, influence our behaviors. You'll want to do less. And our behaviors influence our thoughts. So it's this really kind of complex network of thoughts influencing emotions, influencing behaviors in every direction. It's difficult to go in and just change our emotions, to change our kind of reaction to stress. It's much easier to change our thoughts and our behaviors. And so good kind of evidence-based stress management usually targets those sorts of things, what we do or what we don't do, and how we think. And so sleep, believe it or not, is a behavior. It's something you do or don't do, and you can do it lots of ways. And so I'm going to focus on that because there are some tricks you can use in order to sleep better. And sleeping better can really be a very helpful coping strategy to promote resilience and to increase your likelihood of experiencing positive emotions. And when you do experience negative emotions or when you experience stress, bouncing back. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about sleep. It's really important. It's something that we all do. And for a long, long time, centuries, people didn't really know why we do it. And scientists didn't really understand sleep very well at all. They didn't understand dreaming. They didn't understand much about the physiology of sleep and sleep cycles. And we understand a bit more now, but we still don't understand a whole lot. What we know, though, is that we do it, and if we don't get it, we are not as well able to manage stress, manage the demands of life, etc. And poor sleep is associated with all kinds of negative consequences, both physical, related to our physical well-being, our physical health, and also emotional, our ability to recover from stressors, and things like depression and anxiety are highly correlated with poor sleep. So it's important to sleep well. But good sleeping is a skill. You can learn to be a good sleeper if you're not one now. And so I'm going to share some strategies that come from behavioral medicine and sleep medicine and clinical psychology that are helpful for all of us to be good sleepers. So first, I'm going to share some things that you should do. And what I'm covering here on this page with a bunch of different images is all sleep hygiene. So I'm going to share good sleep hygiene for you. The first thing to do seems really simple, but it's actually quite difficult. People don't adhere to this pretty well. And when they don't adhere to it, it causes lots of problems with their sleep over the long term. And that is to sleep in your bed and do nothing else in your bed. Your bed is made for sleeping. It's not made for watching TV. It's not made for reading, even though people do both of those things in their bed all the time. It's certainly not made for doing work. Your bed is for sleeping. And here's why. We go around every day making lots of associations automatically. This isn't something that we have to do. It's a very basic, in fact, one of the most basic principles or types of learning. And that is classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning. You probably learned about it in Psych 101, Pavlov's dogs. So we make associations all the time without having to think about it between X and Y. When we're in context, certain things happen. When we're in a different context, other things happen. And these associations drive our behavior, and they drive our thoughts, and they drive our emotions very strongly. That's why you just kind of naturally behave one way in one setting, and you naturally, without having to think about it much, behave a different way in another setting. So we want our bed then to be associated with only sleep, because these associations that we create in this very unconscious way are so strong that they can drive our thoughts and our behaviors and our emotions. So if you go to bed and your mind doesn't know what the bed means, because sometimes it means doing work, sometimes it means lying there worrying, sometimes it means watching a scary TV show or a movie about zombies, sometimes it means sleeping. How do you know what's happening, right? So what we want in order to prompt a really quick initiation, falling asleep soon after getting into bed, is for the bed to be associated with just one thing, and that's sleep. So if you're doing anything else in your bed, I encourage you to find other places to do it, because this is very, very powerful, and it really affects how quickly we're able to fall asleep. Unless you have lots of sleep debt. If you have a strong need for sleep, you typically will fall asleep anywhere, right? And so then your problem is you're not getting enough sleep, but that's maybe a side tangent. The next thing to do is to ensure that wherever you're sleeping is dark. And that can be difficult to do in the Northwest in the summer because the days are really long. But light influences our circadian rhythm, and it influences our sleep architecture, the way we sleep and how we fall asleep and when we wake up. And so ensuring a really dark place for sleep is really important. And so that's something to pay attention to, particularly in the summer. Another thing that's important to pay attention to is the temperature of the room. So just like the light temperature really influences how quickly we're able to fall asleep, and it strongly influences our ability to stay asleep and the quality of our sleep. And so ensuring that the room is a good temperature, or that the bed is a good temperature by adding or removing blankets, if you can't change the thermostat, turning on a fan or that sort of thing, is really important. So while these things all seem quite simple, they actually really influence, particularly kind of in combination, how we're sleeping and how easy it is for us to kind of just naturally fall asleep and then stay asleep throughout the night with good quality sleep. So those are things to do: sleep in your bed, sleep in the dark, and sleep in a good temperature. Now I'm going to tell you some things not to do. So the first is to avoid any sort of screen time, certainly while you're in bed, but also probably right before bed too. So avoiding technology during or while you're in bed is important. I mentioned that the bed should be for only sleeping. So that includes the use of your phone. You shouldn't be scrolling Twitter and Instagram and your email right before bed, in bed. It's not good. The light isn't helpful. And then, of course, those apps, as I mentioned, are designed to keep you scrolling and to keep you coming back for more. And so it can be difficult to stick to a routine, a bedtime routine, if you're scrolling on your phone. So we want to avoid technology, particularly in bed. Another thing we want to avoid is alcohol. And here's the problem with alcohol. If you're like me, you have a glass of wine and it feels like you get a little bit sleepy. In fact, you do get sleepy. And it feels like it's just so easy to fall asleep. And it feels like you're getting good sleep. It feels like it's helping you to sleep. And it is. It's helping you to initiate sleep because alcohol is a depressant. But the problem is alcohol changes the way we sleep once we fall asleep. It changes sleep architecture. Our sleep cycles change, our sleep stages, and the quality of the sleep changes. And so if you find that drinking helps you to fall asleep, or that it makes you sleepy, or that it makes you fall asleep quickly, and that feels like a good thing, the issue is you may still feel groggy in the morning because it's really changing the quality of the sleep that you're getting once you fall asleep. And so limiting alcohol consumption, particularly right before bed, is something that's really helpful for people. On the flip side, limiting caffeine consumption, especially right before bed, is certainly important. And that's because caffeine is a stimulant, right? And wakes us up, keeps us awake. And so for most people, having coffee or other sources of caffeine right before bed really makes it difficult to initiate sleep. And it also changes the sleep architecture, influencing the sleep quality quite negatively. So those are some things to avoid. I'm going to share just some good practices for you that fall into sleep hygiene. And the first of those is to set a normal bedtime and a normal wake time. Everyone's needs for the amount of sleep are a little bit different from person to person. Some people need 8 or 9, sometimes more hours of sleep to feel rested. Other people only need 5 or 6 or 7 hours of sleep to feel well rested. That's something that's quite variable from person to person. But your number is your number. And while it does change across the lifespan, within a given week, a given month, a given year, it's going to be pretty consistent for you. And so having a routine bedtime and a routine wake time that gives you enough sleep is really important. And that goes back to this kind of association building. If we are on a routine and we're going to sleep at roughly the same time and waking up at roughly the same time every day, it's much easier to fall asleep, to get that quality sleep, and then to wake up just fine, feeling rested. Another thing that's helpful is to think about your bedtime routine. Avoid work right before bed. It can feel nice to get through some emails right before we go to bed, or to take care of a task right before we go to bed. But what we don't want to do is to do that work right before we go to bed and then go to bed right away. That's because we tend to then keep thinking about the work, right? We keep thinking about the emails or tomorrow's tasks to be done. And so this really can lead to worries and ruminations and kind of runaway thoughts as we're trying to fall asleep, which makes sleep initiation, starting sleep, difficult for us. And so it's important to have a bedtime routine that gives you a buffer between finishing work. You can certainly do work at night, but it's not something you want to do right before bed. So we want a routine that's going to buffer work and sleep. So find some other kind of relaxing activities that aren't going to be stress or anxiety inducing. And last, I mentioned this bedtime routine. It's important to have a bedtime routine. The toothbrush isn't for me to suggest that you should be brushing your teeth before bed, though, as a professor in the dental school, I guess you should. It really is to just suggest that you should have a bedtime routine that you keep most every night. Again, this goes back to having these associations that prime us for sleep. They get us prepared to just fall asleep quickly and naturally on our own without having to do much work or to do much worrying about it. And so you come up with a bedtime routine that's good for you, whatever activities help you to wind down, but engaging in the same routine most every night can be really helpful because it's going to, again, just prime us for falling asleep quickly. So if you do all of these things, then most nights you should have a pretty easy time falling asleep. You shouldn't have too many troubles with staying asleep, and you shouldn't have any troubles or too many troubles waking up earlier than you'd like. But every once in a while, we can still have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. So I'd like to suggest a couple of ways if you're experiencing some mild insomnia or difficulty initiating sleep or maintaining or staying asleep. The first of those is to practice a relaxation exercise, like a deep breathing or slow breathing exercise. And so this isn't just kind of the simple, like, oh, take a deep breath, advice that people tell you when they want you to calm down. Instead, it's actually changing your breathing rate. That's the active ingredient when someone's telling you to take a deep breath. So the thing that psychologists often recommend, because it's easy to remember and it slows your breathing rate down to a nice slow rate, is to take 4 seconds to breathe in, to hold for 4 seconds, and then to take 4 seconds to breathe out. And this is going to prompt a physiological response that's the same cool down response we experience after a fight or flight or stress response. So it's going to reduce anxiety physiologically. It's going to change your breathing rate, which has a cascade of other effects biologically for you. And so focusing on your breathing and slowing down your breathing can be really helpful for reducing anxiety or tension that you might be experiencing before bed, if anxiety is something that's kind of keeping you up right before you're trying to fall asleep. Another thing that can be helpful is if you find that you've got runaway thoughts, lots of worries about the next day or about the week or about a big deadline or some big personal stressor in your life, is to use some sort of an imagery as a distraction. So focusing really carefully on a place that you've been before, that you'd like to go, that you've seen on YouTube, that you find really relaxing or enjoyable or really pleasant. Really paying attention to the image of that place and the sights and the sounds and the smells of that place itself there. That can provide a good enough level of distraction without using technology to really help you kind of minimize some of those worries. Because we, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have this unlimited attention span that we can give to lots and lots of things, right? We're not actually good at multitasking with our attention. So instead, if you're focusing all of your attention on this imagery and not so much on the stressor or the anxiety or the worry, that can be really helpful. And then the last thing that can be really helpful if you're having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep is to remember this very important rule from behavioral sleep medicine. And that is If it is taking you longer than 30 minutes to fall asleep, you should get up out of bed and go do something else until you feel sufficiently tired to go to bed and feel like you're likely to fall asleep pretty quickly. And then you should keep the same wake up time that you were planning on having the next day, even if it means you'll feel a bit sleep deprived the next day. That little bit of sleep deprivation the next day actually will help you to fall asleep faster the next night. And this is going to help you avoid getting into a cycle that can cause or worsen insomnia. The reason we want to get out of bed if it's taking longer than 30 minutes to fall asleep is going back to that first point I made about the bed being associated with sleep and sleep alone. If you're in bed for more than 30 minutes, that means you're lying in bed wondering about things, worrying about things, thinking about things. And so now the bed is associated with anxiety. It's associated with ruminations. It's associated with racing thoughts. And we don't want the bed to be associated with those things. We want it to be associated with sleep. And so if it's taking more than 30 minutes, getting up out of bed, dealing with those worries, dealing with that anxiety, or just getting more tired is recommended. I'd like to just end by making one comment, and that is that these behavioral tools for sleep are really, really powerful. And in fact, among sleep experts, using these behavioral approaches instead of medication approaches are much more recommended for ensuring sleep, improving sleep, reducing or solving insomnia. The behavioral approaches actually work over the long term and promote really high quality sleep. But each one of them alone is not particularly powerful. You've got to use a few of them for you to get really good sleep, and for the good sleep to help you better manage stress and keep a more positive kind of mood and good resilience. And so I liken this kind of idea to that Swiss cheese model that also became widely popular in the pandemic, the Swiss cheese model for risk reduction. Here is that any one of these strategies is like a piece of Swiss cheese. It's got a few holes in it. And so it's not perfect, right? But if we stack it with another strategy or another slice of Swiss cheese with a few holes, the solid parts of one slice cover up the holes in another slice. And then if we stack that with another piece, the solid parts cover up the holes, right? And so we get this block of Swiss cheese slices that is holeless, right? No holes, and it's completely solid. And it's really by adding several different approaches to better sleep or improved sleep that we're going to get to good sleep. And this is really true of any psychological approach for coping and for stress management. They tend to work best when you're putting a couple of them together. No one behavioral approach for managing stress is going to be bulletproof. And so we want to stack a bunch of these slices of Swiss cheese together. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions that you might have. I'll leave you my contact information here in case you'd like it. And I'm happy to answer any questions about stress or about sleep hygiene in particular. I always joke with my students that being trained as a psychologist, I'm very comfortable with silence. I can sit with silence for really as long as I have to. But at the same time, there may be no other questions. Oh, here's a question. How do I convince my dogs that they are really not helping me sleep? You know, I don't know how to do that. That's something I struggle with myself, right? The dog kind of wakes you up. Even if they're cuddling, that makes it easier to go to sleep. Oh, so someone asked, what's a good way to know if you're getting enough sleep and good quality sleep? I think the easiest way and kind of the most straightforward is just to ask yourself, do I feel rested in the morning? And do I feel rested enough throughout the day to do the things that I need to do? Or do I constantly feel, consistently over many days, many weeks, do I feel groggy? Do I feel maybe irritable? Do I feel like I'm not super good with this resilience thing? I'm not kind of bouncing back when little stressors come my way. And so if you're not, then you're likely not getting enough sleep. Sometimes people can get too much sleep, and too much sleep actually be a risk factor for depression. And you would know that because you'd be getting a lot of sleep, like 10, 11, 12 hours of sleep a night. Most people don't need that much sleep. What's more common is people aren't getting enough sleep and they don't feel like they've got maybe the energy that they'd like. They don't have the ability to concentrate or focus or pay attention in kind of a sustained way, or they don't have kind of the reaction time that maybe they're used to. So that would be the concern. And that would be the case for both quantity of sleep and quality of sleep. There's an anonymous question: are CBD gummies for sleep a bad thing? So I think the jury is out. There's a lot of research right now looking at both THC and CBD and effects on sleep, sleep initiation, and sleep quality. There certainly are certain strains that have been found to help make people feel more relaxed. And there are some studies that show that it can improve sleep. The question is it improving sleep initiation, kind of in the same way that alcohol does, right? A glass of wine will put you to bed. Is it improving sleep initiation without improving sleep quality? And the jury is still a bit out, in part because we haven't been using these in a way that's allowed for the study of them scientifically for very long. So we don't have a lot of literature. Yeah, oh my gosh, a few people have asked the same question. Okay, does it help to eat before bed, particularly protein, so that you don't wake up from hunger? That's a little bit person to person dependent. And so, choosing a dinner time that's going to lead you to not feel, to feel full enough that you're not waking up in the middle of the night hungry would be good. And that gets back to setting these routines, right? Having roughly the same routine with roughly the same dinner time, roughly the same bedtime every night. And so you can kind of titrate that for yourself. If you find that you keep waking up hungry, you might want to shift your bedtime closer to your dinner time, or your dinner time closer to your bedtime. Someone else asked if there are any tips on changing old sleep habits. I find I still wake up at 1 a.m. in a panic, and I'm late to milk the cows. It's been decades since I've done that. I think one of the things is that you might consider in that sort of case is using some of those strategies that I recommended for dealing with difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep. So using some of that deep breathing. So immediately when you wake up, you don't reach over and look to see what time it is. You don't reach over and start playing with your phone because you just woke up. But instead, you immediately kind of respond to this waking up in the middle of the night with some of that slow breathing or with that imagery exercise. And you'll find that will kind of help redirect a little bit. At the same time, psychologists are really never worried about people waking up in the middle of the night, because we all do that, unless you're waking up in the middle of the night and it's taking you longer than about 30 minutes to fall back to sleep. So don't stress too much about waking up in the middle of the night, because experts don't really think it's too much of a problem unless you're having difficulty reinitiating sleep on the order of like 30 minutes or more. Then you would start to use some of those other strategies that I mentioned. But you don't want to stress, you don't want to worry, because that creates something that's going to keep you from falling back to sleep, worrying about not sleeping and worrying about being tired the next day. And what would I say? Of your tips, what would you consider the most important to get into a good sleep routine? I would say there are two. I would say it's really important to use the bed for sleeping only. Because that association bit is so powerful, way more powerful than people realize. So that's really critical. And then the other would be to set a bedtime routine that looks quite similar every night and is roughly at the same time. So using your bed for just sleep and having a consistent bedtime and wake up time, those are probably the most kind of powerful among the sleep hygiene strategies. So if you're going to start somewhere, start there. Does frequent waking or tossing and turning impact the quality of your sleep, even if you can go back to sleep quickly? Yes. I mean, we're all waking up in the middle of the night. Oftentimes we just don't remember it because we're not awake long enough to kind of encode the memory. And so that's not something that people would be too worried about. But if you're waking up, maybe if you've got some chronic pain problems or you've got some anxiety that kind of leads you to wake up and stay awake for a little bit, maybe not 30 minutes, but a little bit shorter, that kind of constant waking many times throughout the night, that does impact your that sleep architecture that I mentioned and the quality of your sleep. So you're going to feel less rested the next day. How detrimental to sleep quality is sleeping in on the weekends? So this question helps me to bring up a really good point. And that is, let's say you listened to all the things that I just mentioned and you think, oh God, I commit like 5 errors here. Like I'm really not a good sleeper. But you have no trouble falling asleep. You have no trouble staying asleep. And you feel generally well rested most days. You're fine. You don't have enough bad habits to influence your sleep in a really negative way, right? So we all have some bad habits. No one's doing perfect on those 9 things that I pointed out. And that's okay. The problem is if you've got too many bad habits and you're having trouble falling asleep and staying asleep, then those are truly bad habits that are interfering with your sleep and you want to correct them. So sleeping in on the weekends, that is something that's going to, that's a bad habit because it's not waking up at the same time every morning, right? But it's okay if you don't have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep other days of the week. And so it's not something I would be too worried about unless you really are experiencing insomnia. Like I love sleeping in, it's great. So it feels like a joy on a Sunday morning to sleep in. And that's one of the bad habits that I choose to have of the 9, right? And as long as you keep your bad habit number low, you're okay. It won't impact your sleep too badly. Thank you so much for the great questions. The silence pays off.
Yeah, so if anyone has 1 or 2 more questions, we could probably answer those. Otherwise, y'all might have calendars to get to.
Judge Zamblin, thank you so much for motivating us to do this. And Dr. Randall, thank you so much for your inspirational helps and tips. As we get older, I'm sleeping less and less, and I'm worried about it. Hopefully these tips will put into practice, and we'll get better. We're going to try to take these wellness issues at the center of our mission for our association, and we'll bring back Dr. Randall or other people to address these wellness issues in the future. And this is a great beginning today. Ms. Zamblin?
I just want to thank Dr. Randall for giving me a bunch of tips on what I'm doing wrong. So I'm hoping my sleep will improve. But CBDs, that seriously was asking for a friend. But thank you so much for your time and insights and suggestions. Very much appreciated. So thank you.
Of course. I wish everyone a good night's sleep tonight and some sleeping in on Sunday.
So we have recorded this session today, and we'll put it out on YouTube as soon as it's ready, so that you can watch it again or have other people to join in. Allison, right?
That's right.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Everybody back to work now. Thanks, Dr. Randall.